July 17, 1948, 14:20 hours, Tempelhof Air Base, West Berlin. First Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen watches a group of German children press their faces against the chain-link fence at the end of runway 27. Their clothes are patched with fabric that doesn't match. Their shoes, those who have shoes, are held together with wire and hope. These children stand in the shadow of American C-54 cargo planes, the same aircraft that 3 years earlier dropped bombs on their city, reduced their homes to rubble, killed their fathers and brothers and mothers. Before we continue, please make sure you liked the video and subscribe to my channel. It will take yours few seconds and clicks, and make my day and motivate me to bring more similar amazing stories for you. And tell me in comment section, where are you watching my videos? The engines roar overhead every 3 minutes. Part of Operation Vittles, the Berlin Airlift, the unprecedented mission to supply 2.2 million West Berliners after Soviet forces blockaded all ground access to the city on June 24. Halvorsen, a 27-year-old pilot from Utah, has just completed his third supply run of the day, hauling coal and flour into a city slowly starving under Soviet pressure. He approaches the fence with 2 sticks of Wrigley's double mint gum in his pocket, left over from his pre-flight routine. What happens in the next 8 minutes will transform the faces of 250,000 children across war-torn Germany. What happens in the next 8 minutes will rewrite the psychology of occupation. What happens in the next 8 minutes will prove that in the aftermath of total war, the smallest gestures can rebuild trust that bombs and bullets destroyed. But this story doesn't begin in Berlin. It begins 3 years earlier, 6,000 miles away, in the skies above Japan, where American pilots discovered that candy falling from bomber bays could accomplish what military occupation never could. It could make children smile again. August 15, 1945. The war is over. Emperor Hirohito's voice, broadcast for the first time in Japanese history, crackles through radio speakers across the home islands. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Translation: Japan has surrendered. For the 73 million Japanese citizens who have endured 4 years of total war, 3 years of strategic bombing that reduced 67 cities to ash and rubble, the shock is profound. Tokyo, once a metropolis of 6.7 million, has been 51% destroyed by fire. Osaka, 57%, Kobe, 55%, Nagoya, 40%, Yokohama, a staggering 58%. The firebombing campaign, particularly the March 9th to 10th raid on Tokyo that killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night, has left an entire generation of Japanese children traumatized by the sound of aircraft engines. Dr. Takashi Nagase, a physician who survived the Nagasaki atomic bombing, later writes, in height American occupation begins on August 28, 1945, when advanced units of the 11th Airborne Division landed at Tsugi Airfield outside Tokyo. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, arrives 2 days later aboard his C-54 transport aircraft. MacArthur's task is unprecedented in military history: the peaceful transformation of a militarized empire into a democratic nation, the rebuilding of an industrial economy reduced to 28% of its pre-war capacity, and the care of a population where an estimated 13 million people face severe malnutrition or starvation. The statistics MacArthur's civil affairs officers compile in September 1945 are devastating. In Tokyo alone, 650,000 children have lost at least one parent. Approximately 123,500 are complete orphans, living in the ruins of destroyed buildings, in subway tunnels, under bridges, anywhere offering shelter from the elements. The average caloric intake for Japanese children in urban areas has dropped to 1,050 calories. But beyond the physical devastation, MacArthur's staff identifies a deeper problem. How do you convince a population, particularly children, taught that Americans are demons who will torture and murder them, that their occupiers come in peace? How do you overcome years of propaganda that portrayed American soldiers as barbaric monsters? Japanese wartime propaganda had been brutally effective. Schoolchildren were shown fabricated photographs of American soldiers committing atrocities. They were taught that American pilots laughed while incinerating civilians. They were told that if Japan lost, American forces would enslave the population, rape women and girls, murder anyone who resisted. the Japanese government's own instructions for civilians, distributed in the final months of the war, encouraged civilians to commit suicide rather than face capture. This psychological conditioning runs deep. On Saipan in July 1944, over 1,000 Japanese civilians threw themselves and their children from cliffs. Rather than Sir September 3, 1945, Captain James Mackenzie, a B-29 pilot from the 73rd Bombardment Wing, now stationed at Chokota Air Base for occupation duties, drives through the ruins of western Tokyo in a jeep, part of a reconnaissance mission to assess damage and civilian conditions. His navigator, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, sits beside him with a clipboard, documenting destroyed infrastructure. They pass what was once a school, now just burned framework and collapsed walls. 30 or 40 children are playing in the rubble, their game involving pieces of twisted metal and broken brick. When the jeep stops at an intersection, the children see the American uniforms. The reaction is instantaneous. They scatter like startled birds, diving into holes in collapsed buildings, sprinting down alleyways, disappearing into ruins with the practiced efficiency of prey animals evading predators. One boy, maybe 7 years old, runs so fast he trips and falls, skinning both knees badly enough to draw blood. He doesn't make a sound. H. Mackenzie and Hayes sit in silence for a moment. These children were running from the same hands that are supposed to rebuild their country, feed them, heal them. Mackenzie reaches into his flight jacket and pulls out a Hershey's chocolate bar, part of his career. He calls out in English, knowing the kids won't understand the words but hoping his tone will communicate safety. Nothing. The street remains empty except for an old woman walking slowly with a bundle of sticks on her back. She doesn't look at the Americans. Hayes tries. He places a chocolate bar on a pile of rubble, steps back to the jeep, and they wait. 5 minutes. 10. Finally, a small face appears from a hole in a collapsed building. A girl, maybe 9 years old. She watches them for what feels like an eternity. Then, moving with careful precision, never taking her eyes off the Americans, she creeps toward the chocolate. She snatches it, scrambles backward, disappears into the ruins. Mackenzie and Hayes hear nothing else, see no other movement. That, Mackenzie tells Hayes, was the hardest thing I've done in this whole damn war. He's flown 23 combat missions over Japan, dropped hundreds of tons of bombs, faced anti-aircraft fire that killed 2 of his crew members, but nothing prepared him for the look in that little girl's eyes. That evening, Mackenzie writes in his journal, an entry that will later be archived at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. We destroyed their cities, killed their fathers, burned their homes. Now they're starving and terrified, and we're supposed to convince them we're the good guys. I don't know how we're going to do that. I don't know if it's even possible, but some American servicemen are already trying. The pattern starts informally, spontaneously, without official sanction or coordination. Individual soldiers and pilots, moved by compassion or guilt or simple human decency, begin sharing their rations with Japanese children. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, an aircraft mechanic at Takikawa Air Base, regularly gives his chocolate bars to children who gather at the base perimeter fence. Corporal David Williamson in Osaka starts carrying extra chewing gum specifically to distribute to the orphaned kids sleeping in the ruins near his billet. These small acts of kindness spread through word of mouth among Japanese children with remarkable speed. Where there is food, they appear, though still maintaining careful distance, still ready to bolt at any sudden movement. October 1945, the 509th Composite Group, the unit that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, redeploys to Roswell Army Airfield in New Mexico, but other bomber units remain in Japan for occupation duties and disaster relief flights. The Japanese archipelago faces a humanitarian crisis that winter. The 1945 rice harvest has failed, producing only 64% of normal yield due to lack of fertilizer, lack of farm labor with so many men dead or still imprisoned, and severe weather during the growing season. The Japanese government's food distribution system, already strained during the war, has essentially collapsed. MacArthur's headquarters estimates that without massive food imports, 10 million Japanese citizens will face starvation-level conditions before spring 1946. The American military begins Operation Blacklist, the code name for occupation operations, which includes flying food supplies to remote areas where rail and road infrastructure has been destroyed. It's during these relief flights that the first documented candy drops occur, though the practice likely began earlier through informal, unrecorded actions. On October 12, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, makes a relief flight to northern Honshu, delivering medical supplies to an area hit hard by early winter storms. The official mission report filed with the Far East Air Force's headquarters notes that after completing the supply delivery, Tibbets and his crew dropped approximately 50 chocolate bars from the cargo bay to children gathered near the airfield. The report includes a single sentence of explanation: crew initiative to improve relations with local population. This might be the first officially documented candy drop from an American aircraft in occupied Japan, though Tibbets himself never spoke publicly about it, perhaps uncomfortable with any publicity given his role in the atomic bombing. But word spreads among aircrew. In November 1945, Captain Eugene Heller's crew on a C-47 transport flying between Tokyo and Osaka drops candy and chocolate to children they spot while flying low over a coastal village. Lieutenant James Watkins' crew, delivering coal to Sapporo in northern Japan, improvises parachutes from handkerchiefs tied to candy bars. The children below at first scatter when the objects fall from the plane, still conditioned to associate falling objects from aircraft with bombs and death. But when the bravest child investigates and discovers candy, the dynamic changes instantaneously. What moments before was a source of terror becomes a source of wonder and joy. December 1945. The psychological shift is measurable, documented in reports from civil affairs officers working in occupied territories. Major Sarah Drummond, one of the few women officers serving in occupation roles, compiles data from 23 districts in the Tokyo-Yokohama area. Her report, filed January 4, 1946, notes that in districts where American personnel regularly interact positively with children through food sharing and small gifts, civilian cooperation with occupation authorities increases significantly. Adults who initially refused to speak with American officials become more willing to engage. Information about remaining weapons, caches, hidden military supplies, and potential resistance groups flows more freely. The report includes a striking observation: children appear to be the key to winning over the broader population. When the parents see Americans treating their children with kindness, their resistance to cooperation diminishes markedly. The candy drops become more organized through 1946 and 1947. Some units adopt the practice officially, allocating portions of their recreation funds to purchase candy specifically for drops. The 345th Bombardment Group, stationed at Itazuke Air Base in coordinates scheduled candy drops every Friday afternoon, weather permitting, flying over the same route along the coast where several orphanages and refugee camps are located. Children learn the schedule, gather at designated points, wave handmade American flags constructed from scraps of cloth. The air crews wave back from open cargo doors. Some crews get creative with delivery methods. Technical Sergeant Harold Walsh, a parachute rigger, constructs tiny parachutes from scrap, silk, attaching candy bars and creating colorful streamers that children chase as they drift down. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, an artist before the war, draws cartoon characters on paper bags filled with candy, giving each drop a personality: a smiling dog, a friendly bear, a cheerful bird. The impact on individual children is profound and well documented through interviews, conducted decades later by military historians. Kenji Yamamoto, interviewed in 1985 at age 47, recalls being 8 years old in 1946, living with his grandmother in the ruins of Kawasaki after losing both parents in a March 1945 firebombing raid. He remembers the first time candy fell from an American plane. "I thought I was hallucinating from hunger," he tells the interviewer. "We had been eating acorns and grass, anything we could find. When this silver-wrapped chocolate bar landed at my feet, I picked it up but couldn't believe it was real. I smelled it for a long time before I finally opened it. When I tasted chocolate for the first time in 2 years, I cried. Not because it tasted good, though it did, but because it meant someone up there saw us, knew we were suffering, and cared enough to do something, even something small." Michiko Tanaka, interviewed in 1992, was 7 years old in 1947 when American planes regularly dropped candy near the orphanage where she lived in Osaka. "Before the candy drops," she recalls, "we were taught that Americans were monsters, devils, creatures to fear. But monsters don't give children candy. Monsters don't wave and smile. The adults told us one thing, but our eyes showed us something different. That was the beginning of learning that maybe not everything we had been taught was true. The psychological rehabilitation this represents cannot be overstated. An entire generation was being reprogrammed, their fear converted to curiosity, their hatred softened to acceptance. Through the simple medium of small kindnesses delivered from the sky, the broader strategic implications don't escape MacArthur's attention. In a February 1947 cable to the War Department, MacArthur writes, "The success of the occupation depends not on military force, which we possess in overwhelming measure, but on winning the peace through the hearts and minds of the Japanese people, particularly the younger generation who will rebuild this nation." Small gestures of kindness by our servicemen, particularly the informal practice of sharing food with children, has done more to advance American interests than any official program or propaganda campaign we have implemented. The cable requests additional candy and chocolate be included in supply shipments, not for military personnel consumption, but specifically for distribution to Japanese children. The War Department approves the request. Beginning in March 1947, every supply ship bringing goods to Japan includes an allocation of candy specifically designated for civilian relations purposes. But the most famous candy drops, the ones that will capture global attention and transform a local practice into an international phenomenon, don't happen in Japan. They happen in Germany, in the summer of 1948, in the desperate months of the Berlin Airlift, when the fate of Western Europe hangs in the balance. The connection between the Japan candy drops and what will happen in Berlin runs through the pilots themselves, many of whom served in both theaters, carrying lessons and practices from one defeated enemy to another. July 17, 1948. Back to Tempelhof Air Base, Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen stands at the fence, face to face with 30 German children who have somehow heard that American pilots sometimes appear here between flights. These children don't beg, they don't ask for anything, they simply stand quietly, watching the cargo planes land and take off every 3 minutes like clockwork. Part of the most ambitious aerial supply operation in history. Halvorsen, who flew missions in the Pacific and served briefly in occupied Japan in 1946, remembers the candy drops. He pulls out his 2 sticks of gum and breaks them in half, creating 4 pieces. He hands them through the fence to the nearest children. What happens next stuns him. The children who receive the gum don't immediately unwrap it. Instead, they carefully tear the wrapper into small strips. Children who didn't get gum press the wrapper strips to their noses, smelling the peppermint scent, passing the pieces to others who do the same. Not a single fight breaks out. Not one child grabs or complains. They share. These children who have nothing, who face starvation if the airlift fails, who live in the ruins of a city where food rations provide only 1,200 calories per day, well below subsistence level. Halvorsen is moved beyond words. He promises the children he will return tomorrow and drop candy from his plane. But how will they know which plane is his? The children express concern. There are dozens of planes, all looking identical in the sky. Halvorsen thinks for a moment, then tells them he will wiggle his wings as he approaches the airport. "Watch for the plane that wiggles its wings," he says. "That will be me." The children nod, understanding. A pact formed between a 27-year-old American pilot and 30 desperate German kids on the edge of starvation. That evening, Halvorsen recruits his co-pilot and engineer. He explains his plan. They think he's insane. Dropping anything from a C-54 without authorization violates multiple regulations. If caught, they could face court-martial, end their military careers, get sent home in disgrace. Halvorsen doesn't care. He's thinking about those children and their candy wrapper strips, about the discipline and dignity they showed in the face of deprivation. The next day, July 18, 1948, Halvorsen and his crew load 3 chocolate bars and a few sticks of gum into handkerchief parachutes. As they approach Tempelhof, on their final approach to runway 27, Halvorsen wiggles the wings. His co-pilot opens a window. They push the parachutes out. Looking back, they see small figures running, chasing the slowly descending packages, bright spots of color against the gray ruins of Berlin. The drops continue. Word spreads among the children with remarkable speed. By the 3rd drop on July 20th, over 100 children wait at the fence. Halvorsen and his crew are now pooling their candy rations, making more parachutes from handkerchiefs and old shirts. On July 22nd, a reporter from the New York Times visiting Berlin to cover the airlift happens to be photographing planes at Tempelhof when he witnesses the candy drop. He snaps photographs of children chasing parachutes, of Halvorsen's plane with its wiggling wings. The story runs on July 24, 1948, under the headline "Berlin Airlift Pilot Drops Candy to German Children." The Associated Press picks it up. Within 48 hours, the story appears in newspapers across America. The American public response is overwhelming and immediate. Letters pour into the Pentagon, into airlift headquarters, into Halvorsen's unit. Americans want to help. They want to send candy. Schools organize collection drives. Churches box up donations. Companies pledge supplies. Within 2 weeks, Operation Little Vittles, as it becomes officially known, receives over 3 tons of donated candy. The military, initially concerned about the regulatory violations, realizes they have a public relations triumph on their hands. Colonel William Tonner, commander of the Combined Airlift Task Force, not only approves the candy drops, but makes them official policy. All willing air crews are authorized to participate. The operations staff at Tempelhof coordinates drop zones, schedules, and parachute construction. By September 1948, over 18 tons of candy is dropped over Berlin. By the end of the airlift in May 1949, the total reaches 23 tons of candy and chocolate delivered to an estimated 250,000 German children. Halvorsen becomes a celebrity, though he remains humble about his role. "I didn't invent this," he tells reporters in September 1948. "Pilots were doing this in Japan after the war. I just remembered what worked there and tried it here." The connection between the Japan drops and Berlin becomes part of the narrative, a through line demonstrating that in the aftermath of total war, there are Americans who see beyond vengeance to compassion, who recognize that children are innocent victims regardless of their nation's crimes, who understand that rebuilding trust requires more than words and treaties. It requires small acts of shared humanity. The psychological and political impact of Operation Little Vittles extends far beyond the candy itself. The Berlin Airlift is fundamentally a contest of wills between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Stalin has blockaded West Berlin, hoping to force the Allies to abandon the city, consolidating Soviet control over all of Berlin and demonstrating Western weakness. The airlift, flying over 277,000 missions and delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies between June 1948 and May 1949, proves that the Allies will not be intimidated. But the candy drops add a crucial element. They humanize the American presence in German eyes. West Berliners see that Americans are not occupiers in the traditional sense, not conquerors who view Germans as a defeated enemy to be exploited, but as liberators who will endure extraordinary hardship and expense to keep them free and fed. This perception is crucial. When Stalin finally lifts the blockade on May 12, 1949, it is not just because the airlift successfully supplied the long-term impact on German-American relations is measurable and profound. A 1952 survey conducted by the U.S. State Department in West Berlin finds that 73% of respondents view Americans favorably, a remarkable statistic given that 7 years earlier America was firebombing German cities. When asked what factors most influenced their opinion, 41% specifically mention the Berlin Airlift, and of those, 68% reference either meeting American personnel or hearing stories about American kindness, including the candy drops, which by 1952 have achieved legendary status in Berlin folklore. Children who received candy grow into adults who remember. Dietrich Wagner, who was 9 years old during the airlift, becomes a prominent German politician in the 1970s and 1980s, serving in the Bundestag and consistently advocating for strong German-American relations. In a 1985 speech, he recalls catching a candy parachute in August 1948, that chocolate bar, which I shared with my sister and brother. The same pattern emerges in Japan, where the earlier candy drops have laid groundwork for the successful democratization and economic reconstruction of the country. Japanese who were children in the immediate post-war years, who experienced American kindness during the darkest period of their national history, form a generation predisposed to see America as an ally rather than an enemy. This psychological foundation proves crucial as Japan transforms from enemy to ally, from occupied territory to independent democratic nation, from devastated economy to economic powerhouse. The Japan-US alliance, formalized in the 1951 Treaty of San Francisco and the subsequent Security Treaty, rests not just on strategic calculations, but on a foundation of lived experience, of memories formed when American soldiers shared their rations with starving children. When American pilots dropped candy instead of bombs, the candy drops become a template, a playbook for post-conflict operations that the U.S. military will reference repeatedly in subsequent decades. In Korea, after the armistice in 1953, American personnel distribute candy to orphan children around military bases. In Vietnam during the early 1960s, before the war escalates into full combat operations, civic action programs include regular candy distribution as part of Hearts and Minds campaigns. In Iraq, after the 2003 invasion, American soldiers carry candy specifically to give to children, a practice so widespread it becomes standard in pre-deployment training. The effectiveness varies, context matters, and candy cannot paper over genuine grievances or compensate for destructive policies, but the fundamental insight remains valid. Small gestures of kindness, particularly to children, can begin the process of rebuilding trust. In the aftermath of conflict, Gail Halvorsen, who retires from the Air Force as a colonel in 1974 after a distinguished 31-year career, continues flying candy drops in his civilian life. He participates in anniversary flights, dropping candy over Berlin in 1998 on the 50th anniversary of the airlift, and again in 2008 for the 60th anniversary. He becomes a global advocate for humanitarian assistance, speaking at schools and military academies about the power of small kindnesses. When he dies in February 2022 at age 101, obituaries around the world celebrate him as the candy bomber, the pilot who proved that in the aftermath of total war, healing begins not with grand gestures or political speeches but with simple acts of compassion delivered from the sky. The children who caught those candy parachutes, in Japan and in Germany, carried those memories throughout their lives. Many describe the candy drops as transformative moments, the point when fear began to recede and hope began to return. They are elderly now, those children, or deceased, but their testimonies remain in archives and oral histories, preservation of a remarkable moment when former enemies reached across the chasm of war to offer something sweet to children who had known only bitterness. The story of candy drops from American planes is ultimately a story about human resilience and the possibility of reconciliation. It demonstrates that even after the most destructive conflict in human history, after firebombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands, after atomic weapons that vaporized cities, after 6 years of total war that left 70 to 85 million dead worldwide, it is still possible to rebuild trust between peoples. It is still possible for children who fled in terror from American planes to stand beneath them and wave. It is still possible for chocolate bars and peppermint gum to accomplish what diplomacy and military might alone never could. They can make a child smile, and in that smile plant a seed of hope that the future might be better than the past. The candy bombers, operating initially without authorization, following instincts of compassion rather than orders from headquarters, stumbled upon a profound truth that militaries and governments often forget, that winning a war and winning the peace are entirely different endeavors, requiring entirely different tools. That sometimes the most effective weapon in a soldier's arsenal is not something that destroys but something that delights. That the sound of children laughing can be more strategically valuable than the roar of bomber engines. That in the ruins of cities, among the orphaned and the starving, the traumatized and the terrified, a Hershey bar falling from the sky can carry a message more powerful than any propaganda. We see you, we acknowledge your suffering, and we offer you this small token of a better world to come. The B-29s, that once rained fire on Tokyo, eventually carried food and medicine to remote Japanese villages. The C-54s that could have delivered bombs to Berlin instead delivered coal and flour and, yes, candy. The pilots who destroyed cities helped rebuild them. The former enemies became allies, then friends, and at the foundation of that transformation, at the moment when the turn began, were children chasing parachutes, reaching for falling candy, learning that Americans might be something other than what they had been taught to fear. That lesson, delivered one chocolate bar at a time from open cargo doors 600 feet above shattered cities, helped shape the world we live in today, a world where former enemies cooperate, where reconciliation is possible, where hope survives even the darkest chapters of human history. The candy bombers are gone now. or nearly gone, their numbers dwindling with the inexorable passage of time. But their legacy endures in every German-American friendship, in every Japanese-American partnership, in every moment when former enemies find common ground. It endures in the understanding that after war must come peace, and that peace begins not with treaties signed by politicians but with trust rebuilt between ordinary people, one small gesture at a time, one candy bar at a time, one wiggle of an airplane's wings at a time. The children who were terrified of American planes learned not to be afraid. They learned instead to watch the sky with anticipation, to recognize the wiggle of wings, to chase parachutes made of handkerchiefs, to taste chocolate and peppermint, and through those tastes discover that yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's friend. That transformation, multiplied across 2 nations and millions of individuals, helped create the post-war order that has endured for 8 decades. It reminds us that in our darkest hours, when all seems lost and hatred seems insurmountable, the simple act of sharing something sweet with a child can plant seeds of reconciliation that will grow into forests of peace. And that is a lesson worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth passing down to new generations who will face their own challenges, their own conflicts, their own desperate need for hope in difficult times. Thanks for watching.